Hi, good day. Welcome to Australia Plus Learn English. I'm Shivali, and today we're coming to you from Sydney. I've got a very special guest here today. It's Tiger Webb. Hello, Tiger.
Hi, Shivali.
Tiger is he's a researcher from the ABC's Language Committee, and he's here to join us today because we are talking about Aussie English and Aussie slang and everything related to this topic. So, really excited to have you, Tiger.
Thanks for having me.
I guess the first thing is, to start with the history of Aussie English, how it all began, how it all started.
Well, Australian English really started about as soon as there was white settlement in Australia. So back in really the 18th century, quite a long time ago, 200 years ago or more. And one of the really interesting things is that even 30 or 40 years after the British first colonised Australia, you had people visiting here noticing that children, people who'd grown up here, were speaking with an entirely distinct accent in a different way to the way the British spoke, the way the Irish spoke. So it really does start quite early on. And then since that day, it's kind of become a bit like us. It's a kind of immigrant English, and it's been really shaped by how close we are to the Asian region and all of the waves of migration that have come in over the years.
Yeah.
And a lot of contact as well with Australian Indigenous languages.
Yeah. And remember, if you've got any questions on this topic or if you want to send us your thoughts, get in touch on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. And just on that point about Indigenous languages, there are lots of words that have actually been borrowed from those languages and are actually part of English now. So I've got a list here like boomerang, dingo, didgeridoo, jarrah forests, kangaroo, koala.
Yeah, and I think one thing your audience might be noticing is that a lot of these words are words for animals, and
Yes.
they're words for flowers and fauna and
Yes.
forests and that kind of thing. And that definitely comes from coming to a new continent, this big island, Australia, and just seeing all these new things and needing a new word to describe what they are. No one had ever seen a koala before,
Yeah.
so they just asked the local Indigenous peoples what they called it, and that's how we end up with koala. But another great source of Indigenous words in Australian English is place names. So
Yes.
the capital of Australia is a place called Canberra.
Yes.
And that's actually a local Indigenous word that means meeting place. So it's a place where people meet.
Yeah, so that's an interesting tip there. And just going back to koala, Tiger, many people tend to refer to koalas as koala bears, but that's not really accurate, isn't it?
Yeah, this is I think one pretty good tip if you want to pass as a local in using Australian English. Koalas do look like bears, but they're not actually bears at all. So don't say koala bear, just say koala,
Koalas.
and that's more than you need.
All right, okay. And well, let's look at something more common these days, our love for shortening words and ending words with O and E's and IEs.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I hear quite often. People think that Australians love to shorten words. They love to make words shorter than they are.
Yes.
And two of the main ways we do this in Australian English is by shortening a word and ending it in O. So you might have...
vegetarian.
Yeah, vegetarian
becomes
becomes veggie.
See, we just say it. We don't even
We don't
think
even think
about
we're
it.
doing it. People who work, like ambulance officers, become ambos. And that has its history in, apparently, very early on in the 20th century, people who sold milk down main streets in Australia used to go around yelling, "Milko, Milko," because they were selling milk. And we just sort of took that and applied it to basically
Almost
every other
everything.
word.
Yeah.
So
So I've got a list here actually. Vego, we went through servo, ambos, and then there's also Barbie.
yeah, ending words again by shortening them,
Yeah.
but ending with a E. So barbecue.
Bicky?
Yeah, biscuit becomes bicky.
Yeah.
Barbecue becomes Barbie. Again, it can seem very confusing when you first start out or you first visit Australia or you
Yeah.
first start hearing Australian English,
Yes.
because it's just so common. So
Yes.
many words we shorten like this.
Yes.
But
And you wouldn't have heard it in any other part of the world.
no,
really,
you'd never
right?
hear it in
Yeah.
American English. You wouldn't
Yeah.
hear a lot of it, although you might hear some in British varieties of English.
Yeah.
So don't be confused. Just keep in mind that that's how
Yeah.
we generally love to shorten words.
Yeah. And if you're not sure about, something you're hearing, just feel free to ask. And as we've been saying, we probably don't even notice that we're doing it. So we'd be more than happy to explain and give you a little bit about why we do that. Start it with Milko, doesn't looks like it. But Tiger, I've got a question here from Adnan from Pakistan. Adnan's asking, what's the first step to improving your accent? And that's a really good question, because we're actually going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Just in general, many people in our Learn English community actually want to know, how is the Australian accent different from the British and American accent?
Yeah, well, so I guess one of the biggest things that's different about the Australian English accent compared to the British or the American accent is that no matter where you go in Australia, you could be visiting Sydney, you could be studying in Adelaide, the accent is pretty similar. It's quite the same wherever you go. And that's pretty different. If you go and you visit New York in the United States, the way people speak there, their accent will be
Yes.
very different to
Someone from Texas.
someone from Texas, exactly. And it's the same principle in the UK. But
Yeah.
here, generally, accents are the same no matter where you go. I think there is one thing that we do in Australian English that can become very confusing for people who are studying here or trying to learn the language or visiting.
Yes.
And it's the way that we deal with the R sound, so the sound made by the letter R. And we actually, in Australian English, we don't say it when it appears after a vowel.
Yeah.
So
Car,
car is
for
the
example.
perfect example.
Yeah.
In American English, forgive me, they say car.
Car.
They really do stress the
roll
R
the R,
sound. They
yes.
roll the R at the end,
Yes.
whereas we just say car.
It's a very silent R there.
So if you're having trouble working out where all the R sounds are going, that's just Australian English. Don't worry, I don't know quite why we do it. And
Yeah.
then
Yep.
confusing matters even more. Sometimes Australians will put an R sound in between two vowels.
Yeah.
So if I was to say in Australian English that I saw something quite nice, I would say, I saw it.
But I would say, I saw it. So there's a slight pause there, but you can hear when Tiger's saying it, there's an R that
I saw
comes-
it.
R sound that
I
comes
saw
there.
it? What is a writ? You might be thinking, writ? What is
So
he?
if you're hearing this for the first time, it can be confusing for a lot of people because it sounds like so many different things.
Yeah.
SOAR, saw, or a writ.
There are
whatever
so
that
many
means.
words it could be, and it's
Yeah.
very confusing. But again, I would
Yeah.
just stress, if you do hear something like this and you are confused, please just ask. Most of the time, people who speak Australian English have no idea that the way they're speaking could even be confusing. And we're always happy to, help people out. So
Yeah.
just ask if you're
Yeah.
ever worried.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just on the point about, improving your accent, which is what Adnan was asking. So improving your accent obviously can be done by, really exposing yourself to the accent that, you're interested in learning. So for example, if it's Australian, if it's the Australian accent that you're keen on, you can watch, videos and just kind of get yourself used to how we pronounce words and so on. But I must also say that there is no such thing as, the best accent. Like one accent isn't better than the other.
Yeah, exactly.
It just depends on which part of the world you're using the English language.
Yeah, so I mean, I would not be worried at all
Yes.
about if you think your accent that you're getting with your English might be a bit more American, or it might be a bit more British, or a bit more Australian.
Or even neutral, for that matter. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think no one in Australia will really, no one will judge you.
Yeah.
It's not a thing that you really have to worry about at
Yes.
all, I would say.
Yeah, and the important thing is to be understood, to be able to use language, in this case, the English language, to be able to communicate with people and to be actually understood by others. So, pay attention to your sentence structure and pay attention to how you're communicating with someone. Make sure, you're using all the right words. And if you're not sure, always stop and ask. You can always go back and look at videos and see how it's done, or just carry a little piece of paper with some useful, introductory phrases that you can use so that, you don't get nervous and forget. So, and that's the best way to go, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, just give it a go. Yeah. Well, Tiger, what about, looking at the accent versus the words? So we've talked about how the Australian accent is very uniform.
Yeah. Yeah.
All over Australia, but there are some words that are different.
Well, this is the tricky thing. So even though the accent doesn't change that much depending on where you are, what does change are certain words do change. So one prime example in Australia, we're a big island, we have a lot of beaches, but how we refer to swimwear changes a lot. I mean, you might hear people refer to swimwear as swimmers, or it might be bathers, or it might be togs, and that's different depending on whether you're in South Australia or Victoria or Queensland. It varies kind of state by state. So even though the accent is the same, the word's different.
Yeah, that's true.
And that can be very confusing.
And yes, because even in Australia, we may not really
you might finally think you've mastered
what we're saying.
And then you move to a different state and someone's saying an entirely different word.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. Well, remember, we love to hear from you, so do send us your questions. We're talking about Aussie English, Aussie slang, and everything about how we use the English language in Australia. So we've got Tiger Webb here. Tiger is from the ABC's Language Committee, and he is telling us all his tips on, the history and how to use the English language here. So let's look at something else, Tiger, that again comes up in our Learn English community. The stuff that you only hear in Australia, words, phrases, and of course slang. No worries, have a go. We've gone through have a go. No worries is another one that we often hear, don't we?
Yeah, no worries. People, I say this all the time, and it really just means don't worry about it.
Yeah. Everything will be okay.
Everything will be okay. Yeah. There's nothing to worry about. And you probably, if you're traveling to Australia or you're visiting here or studying, you will hear this a lot because we do like to say it quite frequently.
Yeah. And another favourite one is, how's it going? Or how are you going?
Yeah, this can be really confusing.
Yeah, because they're not really asking you where you're actually going or, how is something going? They're really just asking, how are you?
Yeah, it's how are you?
Yeah.
It's just how we say.
And a good way to just respond to that is just say, I'm good, thanks. How are you? Or you can just talk about your day and have a quick chat and share your plans for the day. So that's really what we want to know, right? Another one here I've got, which is interesting also, is bring a plate.
Yeah.
So we do say this here a lot, bring a plate. We don't mean bring an empty plate. But
yeah. So quite often you might be told to bring a plate when someone invites you over for dinner, or they're inviting you over for a meal or a party. And like Shivali said, they don't mean bring an empty plate. I'm sure they have plenty of plates at their house.
Yeah.
The idea is everyone who comes brings a plate of food that then gets shared around.
Yeah.
You might have heard, in American English, I think it's called a potluck, and there's a couple other words for it. But in Australia, we don't really say potluck that much. We might say bring a plate instead.
Yeah. And we've got this one that everyone knows, mate.
Yes, mate. So Australians, I think it's no secret, we're famous for saying mate all the time.
Yeah.
One thing I would just say though, for people who are newer to Australian English is you might have met someone 5 seconds ago and they call you mate. They're not being overly familiar. Australians just say this word all the time. So no one's sort of imposing upon you. Don't be freaked out. You haven't gained a friend, maybe you have. But everyone says it, so just get used to it and use it yourself as well.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I've got one question here from Lan Zahari, and Lan's asking, what is ochre? O-C-K-E-R.
So Ochre is a word you might find in reference to really broad varieties of Australian English. So ochre is one word for it. Strine is another. It's kind of a humorous shortening of Australian, strine. Um, and people like Crocodile Dundee or Steve Irwin or a lot of other kind of famous cultural exports are ochre. It's that really broad Australian accent that you might think comes from the country. That's kind of what, when people say ochre, that's what they mean.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. That's something we're learning today. We're learning all about Australian English and slang and all these unique phrases that we're using only that you'd probably hear most in Australia. So Tiger is from the ABC's Language Committee and he's here with me to answer all your questions. Tiger, I've got one question here from Antonio from Turkey. He's saying, what's the difference between Australian English, British English and American English? That's a really good question. We've already gone through some of the differences, but just something I want to bring up here. A very big difference between Australian English and how we use English in other parts of the world, American or British English, it's the way we refer to things. The same thing can have two different words like truck or ute.
Yeah, that's a big difference. Is there might be words that we used only in Australian English. Yes. So you've got one there. I think we're the only country that calls these things utes. In America, it might be called a pickup truck. You might have heard people say pickup truck, and it's exactly the same thing. But in Australia, everyone would call it a ute, which I think comes from utility vehicle, which is sort of the technical name for that car. And there's heaps of words just like that.
Yeah, so I've got some here, like we say four-wheel drive, but in American English you would say SUV.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when it comes to a baby, if we're talking about a nappy, it's known as a diaper. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing.
And also a dummy. When we say dummy, we mean what the baby is sucking on, not in American English it's known as a pacifier. Yeah. And another one here, this is an interesting one too. Cookies or biscuits, or bickies as we call them here.
Yeah.
Or biscuits or scones or scones.
Yeah, well, biscuits and biscuits and cookie is a really tricky one, because in Australian English we would say biscuits. It's American English where you'd mostly say cookie to refer especially to a sweet biscuit, like a chocolate chip cookie. In Australia, we probably would say biscuit for most sweet cookies. But if you've been learning a lot of American English, biscuits are actually something entirely different in American English. They're a kind of savoury scone.
Yeah.
And so that's another trap as well. You might think, oh, biscuit, I know what a biscuit is. And it means one thing in Australian English, but this entirely different thing in American English as well.
Yeah, and that can be confusing for learners when they're learning a new language. So just, hope these tips are helping you, because it's good to be aware of these differences and also be aware of where you're using English. Like in Australia, you probably want to bear this in mind as you talk to people here if you're visiting or studying. Okay, let's look at another question here. Remember, we're talking about Aussie English and Aussie slang and everything related to using English in Australia. So really liking all the questions coming in. One here from Norek Chit from Cambodia. The question is, do Australians say garbage or rubbish? That's a good example.
Ooh,
yeah,
that's an
or
interesting
trash.
one. Well, I think trash, we could probably say trash is a more American English usage than it is necessarily Australian.
Yes.
I'd say that you'd probably find people in Australia using both rubbish and garbage.
Yeah.
So there might be a bit of variety in how it's used. But whereas you might see people refer to a garbage truck, you probably wouldn't, I don't know if you'd hear rubbish truck.
Or rubbish chute?
Or rubbish chute. Or in Australia we sometimes say the big sort of area where all of the rubbish ends up.
Yes.
In America you hear people call it a landfill. But we call it a tip.
Yeah.
As in a rubbish tip. because of the way that the cars tip the rubbish into it. And that, I don't know if that's uniquely Australian English, but yeah, so you get both varieties. And you might also hear people say tip as well, and that just means where all the garbage goes.
Yeah, or in our case, we are also using the word tip, but we're giving you tips, and in this case, we're talking about pointers.
Exactly.
That's another meaning to the word tip, just to confuse things.
I'm sorry I'm being so confusing. My gosh.
But that's the beauty of the English language, I think, that, you know, it's influenced by its users. And you learn all these little differences, and it makes it all the more interesting. So another thing that I'm just looking at also is just the difference between American spelling and Australian spelling. And Australian spelling does follow British spelling quite closely.
Yeah, that can be really confusing, especially for people who've been learning English from a lot of American sources, and then they might hear or read something that's from Australia, or they come to Australia and notice that some words are spelt very different. And so there's kind of a couple of main cases where this happens. So one of them is with words like colour. We would spell that the same way the British do. So that's COLOUR. So we would have that U in there. Colour, flavour, all words like that. Whereas Americans would get rid of the U.
Yes.
And the other, I guess, really big one to keep in mind with Australian English spelling is words that end in IZE in America, or IZE in America. We would tend to end with an S instead.
ISE.
ISE.
So realise.
Yeah, realise is a good one.
ISE with us, but IZE with when it comes to American spelling.
And so I guess a good tip is if you're in doubt and you're not quite sure how an Australian would spell a word, just go with what the British would say. I think that's probably going to steer you pretty right in a lot of situations.
Yeah, that's a good tip. And I've actually got another question here from Illuminated from Philippines. The question is, which do you use? Toilet, loo, powder room, comfort room? In Australia, we've got slang for that.
Well, this is a big one. Yeah, we have a few slang terms, more than a few slang terms. I think people would generally say, they might say bathroom, they might say toilet as well, like I want to go to the toilet.
Yeah.
And
bathroom and toilet is quite commonly used.
Yeah, I don't think you would hear, have not heard powder room so much.
Yeah.
But that's very interesting because one thing you don't hear very often in Australian English is what you hear all the time in American English, restroom. We don't say restroom in Australia at all. So just be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, so it's usually bathroom or toilet. So yeah. Now, what about dunny?
I forgot all about dunny.
We say that, right?
We do say dunny. I think originally a dunny was an outdoor toilet that would be not part of the main house. So you'd have to leave the house and go outside and then go find a dunny. But you might, in the course of your travel or your study, you might hear people just refer to bathrooms as the dunny, and that's what they mean. So it needn't necessarily be outside anymore.
Well, I've got another question from Pratik, again on differences when it comes to words. What do we call sauce in Australian English? In the US, it's ketchup.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So that's another interesting one there.
Yeah. So tomato sauce, barbecue sauce in Australian English, but in American English, it's tomato ketchup, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So when we say ketchup, we're referring to what we call here tomato sauce, really. I've also got some comments here, more comments from our audience here. What about the use of use? It never really took off in Australia, did it? Y-O-U-S-E, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, use is a really interesting one. So some varieties of English, particularly American English, they have a word that's a second person pronoun that refers to a group of people. So a great American example is y'all, as in how are y'all doing, how are you all doing? And that can refer to a whole group of people. In Australia, we don't really have a word that's in wide usage that does the same job, although you might sometimes hear people say yous or years or yes, as in how are yous doing, what are yous up to? And that's, again, a second person pronoun referring to a group of people, so it's plural. So you might hear use. People say that in Australia. I think maybe not so much these days, but it was around for a while.
Yeah.
And like you said, it never really took off. But
Yeah.
some people might hear it, and if they do, now you know what they're talking about.
Yeah, and that's the other thing with language. It changes over time. What was used maybe 50 or even 10 years ago may not be used anymore. So, you know, it's constantly changing as well, and it's always good to be aware of what's happening. I've got another one also about, you know, unusual negation. So, yeah, nah.
Oh,
That's another one.
This is very confusing for people.
There's a positive and negative in there.
So, you know, sometimes you might ask a question from someone or talk about them, and you might hear an Australian person say, yeah, nah, you're right, or nah, yeah, nah, you're right.
Yeah.
And this is something that's a bit specific to Australian English. You don't see so much of this in the British and American varieties. And it basically just means the person's agreeing with you most of the time.
Even though they're saying yes and no in the same sentence.
Even though they're saying yes and no in the same sentence. And I think part of the reason why people do it is because they might say something like, it's to not sound so, it's to sound modest. So you might say something like, Tiger, you're doing a great job explaining Australian English. And I'd go, yeah, nah, thank you, it's great to be here. And so it's a way of sort of acknowledging what someone said to you or what you've said to someone while kind of not trying to sound like you're arrogant or you're sort of very
saying, yeah,
yourself.
I'm awesome.
Yeah, I'm great, actually. I'm really good. I'm super great.
Well, on that note, Tiger, you were really awesome, but we've actually come to the end of the live lesson today. Thank you so much for being with us. It was such an interesting discussion.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I guess the final thing would be a question from me. Our learners love tips on how to, you know, get better at learning English, and just to encourage them to keep going and have a go. What would you recommend as, you know, some tips for students and people who want to learn English, Australian English? What should they do?
Well, I mean, if you want to learn Australian English, I would say just make sure you listen to Australian stuff and watch Australian stuff. There's a lot of music, movies, TV shows, things on YouTube. I mean, I know your channel.
Yep, there are lots of videos on Learn English that show the and you can go there and hear the Australian accent, which can help, and it's got subtitles. That's also another thing.
And also, I mean, if you really want to learn about Australian English, just stick with it. You know, maybe watch and listen to things that are only in Australian English. Maybe cut back on the American English, cut back on the British English stuff.
And if you don't understand anything, just ask.
Exactly.
I think that's another really good way to learn, and just write down what you learn so you remember it, especially, you know, phrases and slang and expressions unique to Australia.
Yeah, if you are worried. I mean, I know people who've gone through the foreign language process of learning, and one really good trick is, I mean, we don't need to carry books around with us now. Most people have phones. And so if you hear someone say something and you don't know quite what it is, just write a note down on your phone and you can look at it later, or look it up when you have access to a dictionary or you're back at a computer.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good tip. And on that, remember, you can also go to our website, australiaplus.com/learnenglish. And if you've got any more questions on this topic, we'll be around on Facebook to answer your questions, and we'll try our best to answer as many questions as we can. But we had really good questions, so thank you so much for sending them through, and we really enjoyed, you know, looking through them and having this discussion. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Tiger. It was lovely having you with us today, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.